始めていいですか? Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and good morning to you, depending on where you are. My name is Kazuo Kodama, President of the Foreign Press Center Japan, and I will moderate today's symposium. To my great pleasure, we have more than 200 participants from all over the world. Not only people from Tokyo, London, Singapore, even Barcelona in Spain, Bangalore, India, New York, United States, and so on. Thank you very much for taking part in this symposium. I would like to make a few announcements before we start this webinar. This webinar will be carried out in English with simultaneous Japanese interpretation. If you would like to listen in English, click the interpretation button near the bottom of the window. Choose English and click on Mute Original Audio. This explanation is currently being interpreted, so please check to make sure you can hear the language you want. For the Q&A session, we will be accepting Q&A questions to panelists only through Zoom's button. We will stop accepting questions at 5 o'clock sharp, but you can send them at any time before then. That will help me a lot. Please make sure to write down your name and affiliation when sending your questions. Depending on the time, please be aware that it may not be possible to respond to all the questions. We will now begin the Foreign Press Center Japan 45th Anniversary webinar on the topic Democracy at a Crossroads, the Challenge of Populism and Competition over Values. First of all, a few words about our center, FPCJ. We are a non-profit independent private foundation established in 1976, and this year indeed marks our 45th anniversary. Our mission is to support foreign media reporting on Japan through press briefings, press tours, and individual reporting assistance, just to name a few of our activities. So please visit our website, fpcj.jp, to know more about our center's activities. Currently, there are over 400 reporters affiliated with more than 140 media organizations from 30 countries working in Japan, mainly from Europe, the United States, and nearby countries in Asia. We will continue to facilitate reporting by foreign media, thereby bringing Japan as it really is to the world. Today, we would like to provide you with an opportunity to listen to very distinguished journalists from Japan, the US, UK, and Singapore, who will discuss one of the most pressing issues of the day, namely the challenges posed to many countries from within and without to values including liberal democracy, the rule of law, human rights, freedom of the press, and the independence of the judiciary. Why is liberal democracy being challenged in the United States, the UK, and the rest of Europe, and in Asia? Is liberal democracy primarily responsible for worsening inequalities of opportunity, of access to services, and of income and wealth? Has liberal democracy been deemed to have failed to address the challenges posed by climate change or the COVID-19 pandemic? Another big challenge confronting liberal democracies is posed by China, which has achieved truly remarkable development over the last 30 years based on its unique policy mix of state capitalism and communist dictatorship. China maintains that the issues of Hong Kong and the Uyghurs are domestic Chinese issues. Is this not a symptom of the systemic rivalry over values? It would be remiss if we do not discuss the role of the media in addressing these challenges. These are the questions which the distinguished participants of today's symposium are expected to discuss, hopefully to reach some shared understanding on the topic and on what should be done to support liberal democracy in the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Professor HOSOYA, Yuichosoya, to present his keynote speech on today's topic. Professor HOSOYA is one of the most distinguished scholars in Japan on international politics, the history of international politics, including the history of British diplomacy and Japanese security policy. Without further ado, Professor HOSOYA, HOSOYA Sensei, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Kodama, for your very kind introduction. And I'm particularly glad to join in this seminar because the topic of this seminar is extremely timely. The title is Democracy at the Crossroads, Challenges Posed to Democratic Values by Populism and the Systemic Rivalry. We are living in a very difficult time. I usually say that this year will probably be a turning point in global history as 1941. In 1941, two liberal democracies, the United States and the UK, of course, were fighting against fascist countries. And the future of global history depended on the trajectory of the war fighting with these two countries, great powers, the UK and the US. And then the two powers won the war. And then after 1945, we have seen the evolution of liberal international order. Likewise, we are seeing further liberal democracy is strong enough to defend the value, or further authoritarian regimes could provide much more advantages or much more attractive features to the world, particularly China. Because of the record of Chinese economic growth is higher than most of liberal democracies. So naturally, it would not be a strange thing if developing countries are thinking that they should imitate a Chinese political regime. So in that sense, I think that this year will be a crossroad for democracy. And unfortunately, I saw an interesting article in which it was said that in the last 14 years, according to an American NGO, it is Freedom House, democracy has declined. So, of course, democracy, the trajectory of democracy has both up and down. And we are now seeing a kind of downfall of democracy, or sometimes political scientists are saying this as a democratic recession. So, on the other hand, perhaps it can be possible to say that 2021, the year 2021 can be remembered as the revival of liberal democracy, or the time when liberal democracy could present its virtue, its strengths and advantage to the world. I think that this is partly why the two leaders of liberal democracies, who are President Joe Biden, of course, of the United States, and also Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK, are proposing to organize a kind of meeting among leading democracies. President Biden, before he became president last year, mentioned about the Summit of Democracy to try to enhance the value of, to try to present the value of democracy. And likewise, Prime Minister Boris Johnson proposed to organize D10. D10 summit means that G7 summit meeting plus 3 democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, namely Australia, India, and Korea. So in Cornwall this year, because the UK will hold the presidency of the G7 summit, it would be probable that Prime Minister Johnson will try to organize such G10 summit meeting. But anyway, we will soon see the result of the meeting, whether liberal democracy is strong enough to convince peoples on the value of that ideology. But on the other hand, last year, during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, we actually watched the decline of the power of liberal democracy, because like United States and UK actually saw the widespread of coronavirus affection. On the other hand, in China, by using its authoritarian power to control people, more or less, the Chinese government could control the spread of the coronavirus. I don't know how much we can believe in the reports coming from China, but basically, maybe we can believe in the fact that they could more or less manage the spread of the coronavirus. So beforehand, Western democracies were basically regarded that they could more or less much better health, much better control of these diseases, and they, I think, thought that they could much better way control these pandemics, but this was wrong last year. So China was trying to provide not just vaccines or some medical equipment, but at the same time, China was trying to convince the world that Chinese regime actually is much better than liberal democracies. And that's why Chinese Communist Party, as well as Chinese leading medias like People Daily or Global Times, repeatedly, frequently reported or argues that liberal democracy has actually so many disadvantages in controlling coronavirus. Do we have to believe in this discourse, or can we once more provide very strong examples of the virtue of liberal democracies? Maybe we have been asked this question this year, and we have to provide answer to this. And actually, the other important problem or question is, what is democracy? What is the will of the people? How can we measure the will of the people? Of course, it's not black and white, even though we are seeing a kind of ideological confrontation between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. But actually, reality is that we have so many graduation between the two extremes, democracy and authoritarian regimes. And particularly in Asian countries like Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, they actually were authoritarian regimes previously, but actually these regimes, I mean, in these countries or cities, they could gain democracy and they are democratized basically. So that's why I think that these countries like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, they could actually combine two virtues between two authoritarian regimes and liberal democratic regimes. By combining the advantages of two regimes, I think that they could more or less, in a very good way, overcome coronavirus difficulties. So we shouldn't be complacent about our strength of the liberal democracy, because we have so many problems. In liberal democracies, we are seeing difficulties such as fake news or post-truth. We are saying these kind of things repeatedly recent year, because in election year, we saw so many kind of cyber attacks or a kind of a manipulation from outside, because basically liberal democracy is quite open society. That's why it is much easier to be affected by those attacks or manipulation from outside, as well as from inside. So it's sometimes very difficult to measure what the real will of the people, like Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, or 4 years before between Hillary Clinton and Trump, because actually Hillary Clinton won much larger votes, but in the end, according to the political system of the United States, Donald Trump could win the election and he became president of the United States. So in that sense, we have so many different kinds of democracies. It's not just a single term, but there are so many variety of liberal democracies. And I think that Japan is providing one example of liberal democracy. actually, before 1945, our democracy was quite premature, and we experienced a kind of authoritarian regime. But on the other hand, after 1945, we could enjoy liberal democracy as well as capitalist economy. And we are now safer and much more prosperous than before 1945 in our society with liberal democracy. That's why Japanese people basically fully understand the value of democracies, unlike the UK, France, or US, because these three countries have experienced liberal democracy for so many years. For a long time. So that's why we can, the Japanese people can basically compare two regimes, authoritarian regimes and liberal democracies. We know that liberal democracy is much better. So in the sense, at least, as a non-Western liberal democracy, I think that Japan has so many things to provide to the world, to present the world, that we can be richer, more prosperous, and safer with liberal democracy. But it depends on how liberal democracy can convince the people in the world our virtue as well as advantage to do so. Thank you very much. This is my talk.
HOSOYA Sensei, thank you very much indeed for giving us a very useful, I would say, overview, as well as a couple of good entry points for our discussions on this topic, democracy at a crossroads, today. Now we move on to the panelist presentations. Let me first introduce our panelists. First of all, as a panelist from Japan, we have NHK World Senior Director Aiko DODEN, Aiko, and from the United States, Mr. Simon Denier, Tokyo Bureau Chief for the Washington Post. Based out of Tokyo, he covers both Japan and South Korea. From the UK, Ms. Mary DEJEVSKY, a columnist for The Independent. From Singapore, Mr. Ravi Velol, associate editor and Asia columnist for The Straits Times. Professor HOSOYA Sensei will also participate in the discussion as a panelist. In the panel discussion, I would like to encourage discussion amongst the panelists, the roles expected of the media and government regarding the challenges being faced by democracy. I would also like each of the panelists to speak about the state of democracy in their home country or in their region and the issues it is facing, as well as what role the media should play to address these issues, how the government is also related, and the effect of the media on foreign policy, if any. First, now I would like to proceed in the order below. I will first ask Simon Denier, followed by Ms. Mary DEJEVSKY, and then followed by Mr. Ravi Velol, and finally Ms. Aiko DODEN. Now, Simon, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kodama-san, and thank you to Professor HOSOYA for a great introductory speech. Really framed the discussion extremely well. I'm actually British. I'm going to talk as the Washington Post bureau chief, so I'm going to talk about the United States, a place that I have lived in Washington and covered during the Obama administration, and obviously covered very much from here. First of all, it's no exaggeration to say that democracy in the United States is in a crisis. One of the country's two main political parties, one of its oldest political parties, vast numbers of its supporters, have embraced a lie that the 2020 election was stolen. The legitimacy of the democratic process in the United States has been rejected by a significant portion of the population. And we all saw the scenes at the US Capitol, which I think shocked the nation, but also shocked the world about the state of American democracy. Now, of course, we could argue that American democracy faced a huge challenge in the form of former President Trump's challenges to the legitimacy and the violence which ensued, and that American democracy overcame that challenge. it's certainly true that we could see the glass as half full, but I think that would be complacent. I think that we need to seriously examine the trends that have been apparent for some time and culminated in the events of this January. And I'd like to focus a little bit on the media. I think that the media in the United States has many great qualities. There are many great journalists doing incredibly good investigative journalism in the United States. But overall, I feel that the media is not helping to address the problem. In fact, in many cases, it can be said to be fueling it. Cable news has polarized and divided the country into two competing political teams. Effectively, many Americans root for one side or the other. It's not a question of argument, it's a question of my side is right, I will support that side, the other side is wrong. And too many media outlets buy into or implicitly support that point of view. Social media, including Facebook, has encouraged this division into rival camps. These two rival camps see completely different versions of reality. And you only need to look at the mask wearing, the way that mask wearing was politicized in the United States during the coronavirus pandemic to see an example of that. So what's happening in the United States? When I was in the United States during the Obama years, I felt that the liberal media was insufficiently critical to the Obama administration, and the right-wing media was too critical, sort of knee-jerk critical of the Obama administration. The same thing in reverse happened during the Trump years, where nothing that President Trump did could be accepted or acknowledged. Everything had to be opposed by the liberal media. The conservative media, on the other hand, papered over some pretty egregious, very egregious statements and policies that President Trump laid out. So this is a crisis for democracy because, as Professor HOSOYA said, we're approaching what could be called a post-truth world in the United States. Facts no longer seem to matter. It is really who you support, which version of events you subscribe to. And that's having a real knock-on effect on US standing, on US foreign policy. 1 minute, the United States is out of the Paris Accord for climate change, berating its allies for not paying enough militarily. The next minute, alliances are back in fashion. Climate change, the United States is back in the climate change accord. The countries around the world, countries in Asia, not seeing the sort of continuity in US foreign policy that reassures them and that steadies them, instead of seeing something of a whipsawing effect. Now, obviously, there are continuities. The US-Japan alliance is a source of continuity, but there are many times where we see Biden knee-jerk reaction to reverse what Trump did, Trump having done exactly the same with President Obama's policies. So that US political and media landscape of increasing polarization is a very unattractive model, and I think we need in the media to think seriously about our role in fueling that. Now, I'll just say very quickly about Japan. You know, sometimes here, Japan's consensus-driven model can appear more attractive, certainly when you look at it compared to the US model. But I think we do have to ask ourselves about Japanese democracy too. We do have to ask ourselves if Japanese media carries out the sort of journalism, holding the powerful to account, investigative journalism that democracy really depends on, or if in Japan we have an elite of a ruling party, a supportive bureaucracy, and a often supportive media landscape that fails to ask the right kind of questions of those in power. So I will say that no system is perfect. Each system needs to be addressed. Its faults need to be addressed. But I do think that democracy needs the media needs to take a very good look at its role in promoting healthy democracy, both in the United States and in Japan.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much. Yes, especially regarding the last point, I would like you to also be a little more also maybe specific on why you think so, and also, okay? But anyway, thank you very much. Sure. Now, Mary, you have the floor from London. Can you hear me? And please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you so much for the invitation. One of the rare advantages of what's happened over the last year is that you have, in a way, truly international gatherings across time zones. So I'm speaking to you from London, where dawn broke about half an hour ago, and I realized that it's late afternoon in Tokyo. So this is, in a way, an experience that we've all got used to over the last year. I would very much like to endorse a lot of what Professor HOSOYA said, and also to say that he's got a lot of work to come in the next years, because the political situation in the UK is probably at its most interesting state that it's ever been in my memory, possibly even since the 1950s, since the end of the Second World War. Because if you'd asked me about the state of liberal democracy in British politics, say 5 years ago, the answer would have been that the UK is one of the oldest, most stable democracies in the world. There are a few little defects in its electoral system, which maybe is not as representative as it could be. Nonetheless, everything was pretty much carrying on as normal. The UK was a united country. It had a stable relationship with Europe. It was part, after trying for a few years, it had been part of the European Union, and it looked as though it was going to be a part of that really for the foreseeable future. That all changed with the Brexit vote in 2016. And you can say that can be read as a victory for what's sometimes called nativism. It can be seen as an assertion of a national purpose outside of the European Union. And there will be people who say, well, that actually, it emphasizes that when Charles de Gaulle was opposed to British entry to the European Union, which the British were rather insulted by, nonetheless, maybe he was right. Maybe the British really weren't temperamentally or organizationally suited to being part of the European Union, and that nearly half a century later, that's all come to an end. And it's come to an end in a rather messy way, because the whole of British diplomacy since pretty much the end of the Second World War has been orientated to Europe. And the whole of the diplomatic corps, the foreign service, officials in the UK have been orientated to Europe, with, of course, half an eye on the transatlantic relationship, but nonetheless towards Europe. And that's over. And one of the interesting things, why today is a particularly good day for me to be speaking to you from London, is because today sees the launch of a policy paper, which is apparently more than 100 pages long, about what's called Global Britain, which is about the plans and the ambitions of Britain separate from the European Union, and trying to rebuild relationships as a global presence. And the word is that the emphasis will be not on relations with Europe and the European Union, but further afield. On the one hand, it will be rebuilding relations with the United States, but also it'll be looking to Asia. and it'll be looking to Asia in one way, as Simon was talking about, this plan for maybe something called the Democracy 10. Although this is arousing some criticism, because people are saying, well, how do we define democracy? There's going to be questions, especially I think when it comes to defining India, say, as a democracy. What sort of democracy qualifies as a democracy? That's quite a difficult question. But it's also, of course, because of the big and rising presence of China in Asia. And this apparently, as I say, this paper is going to be published today. Britain's relations with China is going to be a central part of that paper. So Britain has, following the Brexit vote, not only has it had to reorientate its foreign policy, but it's also facing strains at home, because different parts of the UK voted differently in the referendum. Specifically, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union, and this has created strains inside what 5 years ago looked like one of the most stable countries in the world. Suddenly, it's facing separatist, fragmentary tendencies, with the possibility that Scotland could break away, become independent, that Northern Ireland could become part of the Irish, join the Irish Republic and unite the island of Ireland. We're looking at possible changes in the composition of the United Kingdom, which would have been unthinkable even a few years ago. Now, I think I would add to that some of the effects of the pandemic, which have been maybe more profound in Britain than in quite a lot of other countries, because we've done so badly in terms of the figures, the per capita death rate. And we're only now rehabilitating ourselves a little internationally because of the success, as it's seen, of the vaccination program. But what the pandemic has shown, and one of the things that has been particularly interesting and is being studied by the media in the UK, is what it's said, what it's exposed about Britain. And two of the things that it's exposed is one of them is that the UK is among the most unequal societies in the world after the United States. And the other thing is that the level and standards of public health in Britain, although we're very proud of the National Health Service, and that's something which is always raised, nonetheless, the actual levels of public health are not very good on international comparisons of developed countries. And there's going to be a lot of questions asked about this when it's all over. And one of the big questions that has been raised with the media in terms of the pandemic is that, at least for the first half year, there was, to my mind, quite a disturbing amount of conformity in the British media, that there was very little challenge to the government and what the government was saying, what the government was recommending. In some ways, all sides of the media, which of course, as you know, in the UK, it's very competitive, it's very divided, and Simon talked about the media in the United States as being quite polarized. It's basically always been like that in the UK, especially in the press, the written media, and it was very little transition for the UK to get used to social media, because our press was always as divided. Broadcasting is a different picture. But I, for one, was quite critical of the way that the media seemed very uncertain, how far it was, in a way, unpatriotic and unhelpful to be criticizing the media at a time of crisis. But on the other hand, the government needed there was a purpose to challenging the government, because there were things that were that were wrong with British policy, but this wasn't being talked about at that time. And it's only really now, in the last 3 months or so, that the media has gone back to its critical approach. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions. I'm sure there'll be millions of questions.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. Yes, so very, very helpful. Also, very insightful, I think, observation on what COVID-19 actually has exposed the UK society's ills or whatever. Now, let us turn to Singapore. Ravi, you have the floor. Tell us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Kodama-san.
Yes.
A good day, everybody. And let me thank the FPCJ and Kodama-san, of course, for inviting me back to speak at this venue. I understand it's a very important year for the center. And as a co-founder of the Foreign Correspondents Association of South Asia back in 1991, I extend greetings to FPCJ in Tokyo. Since I was last at your center, that was 2 years ago, I was at a conference to discuss the free and open Indo-Pacific. So much has changed and so much has solidified around that concept. And now we have its security manifestation called the Quad, which has just had its first summit meeting. And it looks like more nations are likely to join in. Next month, we expect France to be exercising in Asian waters with the Quad navies. So we're in the middle of very profound changes to the world. And, I must say that Japan has led the thinking on many of these issues, particularly on the Indo-Pacific. And in its own way, it's a bulwark for the level order in Asia. So for that reason, today's topic on democracy at a crossroads is, I'd say, quite topical. Well, that said, do excuse me, do pardon me when I say that the concept of liberal democracy, as is commonly understood around the world, is pretty much alien to the Asian region. It is, in so many ways, it's an imported concept. In Western democracies, you're told that governments get that people get the government they deserve. In Asia, the wisdom has been as the ruler, so the people. So it was traditionally been a top-down order. Well, that changed in the post-war period and the period of decolonization that was seen in much of Asia after the Second World War. And these anti-colonial movements being mostly led by nationalists and charismatic leaders. And with their departure from the scene, the idealism has eroded and practical necessities of governance have begun to take priority in several areas. And we see that continuing to this day. With that said, while liberal democracy is not homegrown in Asia, the democratic urge has been definitely kindled, and I would say it's even irreversible. If you look at what's happening in Myanmar today, even civil servants and I'm told even off-duty policemen are joining in the demonstrations. If you see political participation in elections, it's pretty robust. In the Indonesian election of 2019, the presidential race, the turnout was 80%, and that had improved from 69% in the 2014 election. Voter participation has been increasing in India. And in November 2019, when Sri Lanka held elections, there was 70% turnout. So this is it pretty much establishes that democracy as a concept is popular in Asia. People do want to participate, and it's taken deep roots. And even in many nations that used to be directed by the army, I'm thinking here of Pakistan, Indonesia, and until recently Myanmar. They saw value in having a democratic facade or a cover or whatever you want to call it. And what's playing out in Myanmar today, in some regards, is because of Aung San Suu Kyi's failure to accommodate the military adequately, and that's led to the current predicament. But this is not a one-way street, and democracy has to be guarded and nurtured, or it could die. Myanmar is the latest example of that. And we've seen what happened in Hong Kong in the last 4 years. In some ways, if you look at the region I'm in, Malaysia has regressed. Under Najib Razak, there was already a constriction of democratic space, but the current Prime Minister, Muhyiddin, it could have said to have even shrunk further. Malaysia is today under an emergency rule, and the cover for that emergency rule is the pandemic. It's interesting to note that the last time all of Malaysia was under an emergency was in 1969 when it had racial riots. There seems very little chance of Parliament convening until the current Prime Minister believes he can cobble together a majority that will keep him in power. Look at the biggest of world democracy, that's India. And this year it was, somebody mentioned Freedom House. And, India was dropped from the list of free countries. And today on Freedom House's list, at least, it's in the list of the partly free. And yet it's a member of the Quad, which is supposed to be a gathering of, free and democratic nations espousing a certain worldview. If you look beyond, at what most of you call the Middle East, but I'd like to see it as Western Asia, the Arab Spring and the rise of the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, it was seen as a watershed moment for West Asia. But we all know that it was brutally put down. And today, General al-Sisi is firmly in power, having ejected Mohammed Morsi. It was just last year that Adnan Khashoggi was murdered in Istanbul by the Saudis. And that's partly because of his ties and sympathies with the Brotherhood. So, the Brotherhood is seen as a threat by the regimes in the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia and in many parts of the world. And yet, 2 years ago when al-Sisi hosted the first Arab League European Union summit in the resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh, all the key European leaders showed up to attend, including EU President Donald Tusk, Theresa May, and Angela Merkel. So just as in Asia, where you see the people taking liberties with this concept and applying practical necessities to what is really a worthwhile ambition, you find European leaders doing the same thing. Whether you call it practical necessity or compulsions of office or whatever it is, but you see these strains all over the world. Mrs. Merkel, I'm sure, Mary, you know this better. Her sympathies are to Viktor Orban of Hungary, for instance, or even Xi Jinping in China. It's amazing, how much can be ignored in the interest of getting Volkswagen access to markets. So distortions to the liberal order are coming into view from, some of the very sources that are vehicles of the order. I'm talking here of social media. The flow of thought used to be top down, but today the flow is more democratic and it flows both ways. But this is also raising nativism, which Mary talked about, and tribalism and parochialism. And Brexit was a product of that cynicism on the part of a few who would, I'd say, even were unafraid to lie. I happened to be in London for Brexit, and I was just amazed at the kind of lies that one was seeing from some of the groups that were pushing to leave. Um, and the final point I'd like to make here is about strongman rulers and the risk they pose to democracy. The uneven benefits from globalization and disruptions from technology and the global shifts of production, they all have produced a period of global stress and change. In sociology, they call this a state of anomie. And this state of confusion and anomie has led to the search for strongman rulers. In Asia, that's most notable in Prime Minister Modi in India and President Xi in China, even to an extent Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. But from what I've seen in these last 40 years in journalism, I'd say that strongman and liberal democracy are actually a very uneasy fit. And what happens when strongmen are in power is that the necessity to please this person often leads to huge problems. And this we've seen in Southeast Asia, particularly. I think the massive powers accumulated by President Xi in some ways, I think has contributed to the current situation. I can talk about it in detail in the Q&A or in the discussions that follow. Let me stop here, and Kodama-san, I thank you once again for this opportunity to come back to FPCJ. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, and also thank you again to really provide us with a very much limited time available, very good overview on what's happening in Asia Pacific or even the Middle East and beyond. Thank you very much. Now, last but not least, I would like to ask Aiko, Ms. DODEN, to share her views on this topic. Aiko-san, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Kodama, for inviting me to speak at this conversation. But I was just remembering that this is actually where wealthy figures like Jiang Zemin or Aung San Suu Kyi or Kofi Annan or the astronaut John Glenn all came to speak. So I somewhat feel unease being on the wrong side of the room today. This is such a timely event, as everybody has said, to address such an important issue, and its relevance is being reinforced as we live through the pandemic. Democracy is perhaps not only at crossroads, but is being put to a serious test. Today's event may be an intellectual exercise, but needless to remind our fellow distinguished speakers, something to keep in mind is that there are people, including journalists, in countries like Myanmar or places like Hong Kong, risking their lives to defend democracy as we speak in the region that is now commonly referred to as the Indo-Pacific. Democracy can mean many things. If democracy was about free and fair election and about stable politics, in Japan, perhaps we have come to take the system for granted, so much so that the voters do not quite look at it as a valued opportunity to exercise their rights. I'm talking about voters' turnout, especially among the youth, has remained notably low. I understand Keizai Doyukai, Japan Association of Corporate Executives, organized an open forum in January to provide a multi-stakeholder platform to jointly discuss how to bring politics and economy closer to young people so as to encourage their active participation. Japan's population is graying and shrinking, and understandably, businesses are mindful that cultivating youth's interest in politics and economy is crucial. If democracy was about equality and equity, the recent sexist remarks by the former Prime Minister Mori exposed the shortcomings on the part of the Japanese society, questioning if the society was really inclusive or diverse. Women were upset, to put it mildly, but sadly, many said that, to be honest, they weren't surprised. The 2020 Tokyo Olympics, when it does take place, will no doubt be about medals and records, but it will also be remembered for having reminded the Japanese and the world in the run-up to the Games of some of the key tenets of democracy. If democracy was about transparency and accountability, all eyes are on the Diet hearing this week, perhaps, over dinner scandal in which officials and politicians were treated to lavish dinners from executives of telecom giant. And I must say the general public had to wonder what an over $700 dinner looks like, but they were also put off by the fact that the culture of so-called dinner meetings was still very much alive, while most of the public were obediently practicing stay home under the pandemic. So this boils down to the issue of trust. The trust between the government and the people is the key in jointly fighting the pandemic. Many see this as something that may eventually erode that trust. And media is also being tested as in terms of what to report and how we report the news. Now, I cannot speak for all the media, but covering the COVID-19 has become a priority that consumes both airtime and manpower workforce in the newsroom for TV media, while competition is intensifying between the conventional media and the new forms of media. According to the recent NHK poll, out of multiple choices, 87% responded that they still relied on TV for COVID-19 related news, but 52% said internet, 45% said newspaper, and 12% said SNS. On the foreign policy front, Indo-Pacific has become the buzzword, and there is the tendency of the strategy to be discussed and reported in the context of free trade and freedom of navigation, and values like democracy and human rights on the back burner. There is hope that under the Biden administration, Washington will take up those issues, and I have taken note of the fact that at the recent online Quad summit meeting among US, Japan, Australia, and India, the leaders did take up Myanmar issue and urged the country to restore democracy and strengthen democratic resilience. The Quad is generally understood to be a mechanism to contain China, but values like democracy and human rights should be front and center, regardless of China factor, especially in Japan, where the government has long advocated the concept of human security, which is a human-centered approach to security. Human security has been the central pillar in ODA projects implemented by Japan in empowering the people. By nature, media is reactive. It reports newsworthy events and tries to report with speed, accuracy, and fairness. But when almost anyone can be a reporter on SNS, journalists need to understand that they are competing with far more reporters than before and can be reaching far more readers and viewers, and that they too need to find a way to stay in business at this very tumultuous time for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. DODEN, for your presentation. I especially appreciate your endeavor to define what we mean by democracy from various, I think, perspectives. Because I have now just two written questions from the audience. One actually regards, indeed, the definition of the liberal democracy which we are discussing. To put it, well, I have this question is raised by Emeritus Professor of Keio University, Professor Yuichi Hirono, whom I very much respect. He put it this way: please tell us why you chose the older concept of democracy rather than the new version, which seems to contribute better to resolve the emerging issues of the current world, including COVID-19 pandemic. I say, Professor Hirono Sensei, I think Ms. DODEN gave a very, I think, a convincing answer to your question. I do not think the term liberal democracy is just old-fashioned or the things of 19th century or 20th century, I think, which is still very relevant. And then, as Aiko explained in her presentation, I think, which covers indeed the human security concept, it covers indeed 2030 sustainable development goals as such. So this is my rather short answer. Now to Professor HOSOYA. HOSOYA sensei, this is actually what I've been expecting from the floor, especially from Chinese journalists. In a nutshell, this is a question raised by Mr. Son Shu-pin of Kankyu Jiho, who is a Tokyo-based correspondent from China. He asks this way: listening to your presentation, Professor HOSOYA sensei, may I also assume that the economic development has anything to do with democracy or not? In my view, society will I think, will develop in accordance with the level of development, unquote, quote unquote. I would phrase his question this way. This is also, I've been struggling to address this issue for a long time. In Japan or in China, we have a proverb saying, "Ishoku tarite reisetsu shiru," meaning only when one is well fed, well clothed, well housed, people can really understand virtues, including maybe human rights or whatever. But if that being the case, are we not somehow make the issue of human rights or democracy a kind of relative concept? So anyway, so this is still ongoing debate, even in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, whatever. So to this, I very much I put the question to you, Professor HOSOYA. Could you respond to this question? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. May I now respond to the question? I think that the question is very important because now many countries in both Asia and Africa are watching Chinese example because, well, Chinese records of, as I explained, Chinese record of economic growth in the last 1 or 2 decades has been especially brilliant. So that's why previously we didn't expect that such kind of authoritarian or socialist regime could introduce a high level of economic growth because we had a living memory of the socialist Soviet Union, and it failed. But on the other hand, in a communist country like China, governments always have to be infallible, no mistakes. Because there is no alternative, so always the leader must be right, and the policy of the regime must be always right. So there is no need for any leaders in communist countries to apologetic to that. But within a decade or two, we will see quite rapid Asian society in China. And of course, there are so many problems inside of China, but I don't know whether China can remain infallible with no alternatives, with no mistakes. On the other hand, in liberal democracies, of course, always governments mistakes. And if the mistake is so huge, we can change the government. So we always have different options, alternatives. But on the other hand, as Simon explained, in some liberal democracies, we see a rapid polarization, and well, the middle class as well as centrist ideology has been falling down. So we can see extremes opinion. So in that sense, both communist regime or authoritarian regimes and liberal democracy have problems, and we have to overcome new challenges. So I think that now, even though Chinese record is quite good, within 10 to 20 years, I think that the United States will become much more powerful with the growth of population, with new innovations. But on the other hand, until then, I don't know whether liberal democracy can survive the current difficulties. That's why I said that the year 2021 is a turning point, whether liberal democracy can overcome their own problems inside.
Thank you, Professor HOSOYA Sensei. Now, Simon, you have the floor, but just let me also add one related question to you, because I have another question from Ambassador Sadaaki Numata, who used to be my boss in the foreign ministry, and then who also once also very distinguished press secretary of the government. He asks as follows, quote, "What role can Japanese journalism play in the global debate on democracy and authoritarianism," unquote. But I would rather add to this that you mentioned that, of course, in your earlier presentation, of course, the Japan's consensus-driven model. Sometimes it seems to you that lacks the sort of accountability and journalism upon which democracy depends you. So could you be a little bit specific on this, or please brave to share with us any example on that? And so, but anyway, also to earlier question, if you would like to respond.
Sure,
please.
sure. A lot of things there, actually. So I'll start with Japanese media, and again, a big subject. You know, having lived in China for 5 years, I have a lot of respect for Japanese democracy and free speech. You can speak out here. You're not going to get arrested. And that, to me, is a great thing. But there is a situation in Japan whereby, as DODEN-san mentioned, turnout in elections has fallen. Pew Research did a survey of 34 countries and asked people, does your vote make a difference? And the lowest score of any of those countries was in Japan. 55% people said their vote didn't make a difference. That was lower than Lebanon, Tunisia, and Hungary, that were the next lowest countries. And I think that you have to look in Japan at the press club system. That's a big way that the government uses to control the media, to trade access, essentially, for favorable coverage. So again, put it in context. There's a lot of great journalism in Japan, as there is in the United States. I don't want this to be taken out of context, but the government and the bureaucracy does exert, through overt and covert ways, control over the agenda. There is too much unquestioning reporting of what the government says, just putting out the story without comment and without real analysis or criticism. So I find that frustrating. There is sometimes a lack of good investigative journalism compared to some other places. So I do have some issues with that. I will, very briefly talk about, and we could go back into this, the issue of economic development and whether that's important for democracy. Whether that should be set as a more important value for Asian countries than democratic freedoms. Of course, if you don't have a house and you don't have water and you don't have electricity, then those are the things that matter most to you. But money is not everything. Justice and free speech do matter. There is a lot of inequality in China. There are a lot of migrant workers who don't have rights, who don't have very many rights. There are a lot of people who suffer injustice in China and can't do anything to redress that injustice. In fact, if they try to redress the injustice, if they try to protest, if they try to speak out, they essentially become targets of surveillance and enemies of the state. The victim essentially gets blamed in the Chinese system if they try to speak out. So economic development is important, but economic justice and equality is also important. And you only need to look at the situations of the Tibetans and the Uyghurs to know that economic development does not bring justice or self-respect to those peoples within the Chinese system. So I do respect China's achievements on the economic front, but I do think we do have to say that there is more to the soul of a nation than simply making money. What the Japanese media should do to promote these values. I mean, Japan. Let me just say that Japan does try to promote, democratic values. We look at the TPP as an example of Japanese leadership. We look at the Quad as examples of Japanese leadership in Asia. As DODEN-san mentioned, I think there is a question mark about Japan's policy towards Myanmar in terms of whether Japan fully supports democratic values there, or is more worried about a strategic game against China. I think that the Japanese media can do more to examine Japanese foreign policy in these areas a little bit more critically, both the positives and the negatives, and to try and really analyze what's going on rather than just simply repeating what the government is saying without really questioning it so much. So I think getting out there, reporting on what Japan is doing on the ground is what needs to be done, and reporting on the positive and the negative.
Thank you, Simon. Now, from the moderator's position, I have a question to Mary regarding, again, your earlier also explanation on why, of course, where the Brexit has happened, and then, in comparison to 10 years ago, the situation, at least the snapshot of the British democracy seems to be, if I use my own words, seems to be rather debilitating somehow, or seems to be weakened. But then I'm obliged to ask you then why this is really happening. What, in your view, is the root cause of this a situation? I mean, UK seems to be, in my view, actually one of the oldest, of course, stable democracy in the world, I think, which is a great model of democracy for the rest of the world for many decades, I think. And then still, but as you mentioned, even now, your United Kingdom seems to be breaking up, as you say. I think there's a real danger to it. So what are the real causes? I know I was based in Brussels for the last 4 years, as Japanese ambassador to the European Union, and I followed very closely the Brexit negotiations and British mentalities. Like 40 years ago, when I was at Cambridge summer course, British history professor wrote one sentence on a blackboard saying, "Fog in the Channel isolated the continent." That seems to be the British, way of looking at it. But anyway, I very much appreciate your view on this kind of question. Mary, please.
I think this is the big question that very many people in Britain have been asking themselves ever since the referendum. I think, looking back, that one of the reasons was that liberal democracy, as we've all been talking about it, and combined with Britain as part of the European Union, that both of these were seen as rather elite projects, that not enough had been done to convince really the majority of the population that membership of the European Union and the sort of democracy, that parliamentary democracy that the UK had, was actually in the interests of the majority of people. And it was very difficult actually to see that because of the British electoral system, where the country is divided into constituencies, and rather like America, where the majority dictates who gets elected. There's no proportional system in the UK, which means that smaller parties and smaller strands of opinion simply aren't represented in Parliament at all. And when you look back, you can see there was something almost like a sort of popular vote. The leader of UKIP, the party that really pioneered the Brexit project, he never had a seat in the UK Parliament, Nigel Farage. He's always been outside Parliament, but he managed to attract this huge, about a majority of British opinion when the question was asked, should we stay in the European Union or not? And I think that represented, it illustrated a big failure of British democracy, that there wasn't a majority for the status quo. It was seen as an elite project. And what's happening now is, in a way, a sort of an attempt to rebalance, to look at why Britain voted as it did, to try to make the best of it. But also there's the current government before the pandemic, and now it's returning to a project of what it calls levelling up. I talked about the social inequalities that have been exposed by the pandemic, but they were there before, and they were part of the reason, I think, that there was this opposition to the status quo and to Europe as a sort of symbol of that. And levelling up is designed as a project to try and make Britain more equal, to make cities that are seen as poorer than, say, rich, thriving London used to be, to try and make them more equal, to make them look like more countries, really, ironically, countries in Europe where there is less of a gap between rich and poor areas, between different cities, different parts of the country.
Thank you very much, Mary. Now turn to Ravi. You mentioned, well, why actually the mass of people, even in the also the Asia-Pacific region, I think, turn to a strongman leaders rather than maintain a faith in the democracy or liberal democracy as such. My question to you is that, of course, or you said also even that somehow, well, the like uneven benefits of globalization, disruption from technological advances, and the swift march of technology, all these may be issues somehow produced a state of enemy. So my question to you is that, may I also assume then liberal order, as you say it, is not well equipped to address such plethora of disparate issues or challenges? Looking from Singapore to the region, and how would you respond to this question?
Well, Kodama-san, that's a very penetrative question, worthy of the best journalists, anywhere in the world. Thank you for that question, and it really leaves me thinking. But the fact is that one of the things that's been manifest is that we don't many journalists, in fact, don't seem to be able to account adequately for the state's perception of things as well. We forget to take into account that the state also has a point of view that needs to be very seriously considered, and that, liberal values cannot exist just by themselves, they're always in a particular context. And that is why, whenever I write, I'm doubly cautious about being hypercritical of states, because at the end of the day, they have to deliver on a whole range of subjects that the journalist or the man in the street doesn't have to think about all the time. So yes, we do live in very challenging times. The whole misinformation game is something that you have to take into account. Very deliberate attempts, sometimes on the ground, to change opinions. Some of the loudest voices come from the ground, and it's just 10 people on the ground. They are the faces are not seen, but they seem very loud, and they resonate. And they resonate across the ether, you see. So there are, liberal democracy is not a perfect thing. It's a work in progress, and it's for something that everybody has to contribute to build together. If you look at Hong Kong, for instance, I mean, it's while you can blame the Chinese for what they've done, and I think it's quite despicable what's happened there. But it's also interesting to see if the people pressing for democracy also made the best of their chances. In 2014, when when Beijing changed the law, the election law, and said they are happy to have anybody stand for elections, but let the slate be chosen. Let there be a big slate, but let Beijing have a slate in a say in who stands. I mean, some of these adjustments could have been made by both sides. In Myanmar, for instance, I think Suu Kyi could have, accommodated the views of the generals a bit more. Maybe they had a point of view to be listened to. Maybe there was some electoral malpractices, but you couldn't have just wished them away entirely. And I think, from what I can see, the military negotiated with her till the very last minute, and it was only on Monday morning, just a couple of hours before Parliament was to convene, that they moved in. So, let me just say that, this, as I said earlier, that this is something for everybody to participate and build together. It cannot be the responsibility of just the state alone to maintain level democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi. Aiko-san, let me follow up on this. Maybe since you've been covering Southeast Asia, even Thailand or democracy or the Indochina, including Myanmar and so on, so please respond to what Ravi-san said. And then on top of that, I have a separate question about COVID-19 pandemic. You've been also following this very intensely. And then earlier we heard from Mary that, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic somehow exposed the two ills of UK societies, the weakness of the public health system, and also exposed the rather worsening inequalities in its society. What about, how do you say, in Japan, what has COVID-19, you think, in your view, exposed our problems, or somehow something good is coming out of this pandemic's exercise? Sorry, two different questions, but if you can respond to these questions as you like, please.
About Myanmar, which I feel very strongly about, I've been covering the country since the military days, been to the country perhaps 40, 50 times. It is really such a sorry situation that we are witnessing in Myanmar today. And it's still ongoing process. And we really have to be careful, keep an eye on where the current situation will lead the country to. But talking about the democracy, I have this impression that the people perhaps might have had too much stress on the democracy as something, a political rivalry between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military. But democracy is really about people. And during my last visit to the country, which was last year, I interviewed a young woman who was working in the city. I followed her to her home, which was across the river, which was totally untouched by any sort of development. No electricity, no water. She was living in a hut, and I asked her what was her dream. And she said that her dream was to have a house with a garden for the family to live. And I'm sure by that she meant clean water, electricity, education for her little brothers and sisters, and basic health service, something that the country, for the poor, has not been able to provide yet. So I do think that the journalists will have to keep an eye on not just the contest for power between the Aung San Suu Kyi democratically elected government and the military, but democracy as something about the people themselves. And about the pandemic and what it has exposed in Japan, it has exposed many shortcomings in the society, but many of the problems, as Mary said, had already existed even in the pre-pandemic days. Inequality would be one, the woman's status in the society would be another. There is a very serious statistics in which, if you look at the number of the unemployment, women's rate of unemployment is unusually high, and also the number of suicides. The women tended to be ranked high in that picture as well. So that is something that pandemic is not just about a health issue. It has exposed all the shortcomings that exist in our society. And it's something that the journalists have to keep in mind when we cover the issue, that it's not just about the health issue, but much more goes beyond that.
Thank you very much. Now, I have actually one very pertinent question raised by Kyodo News Agency's Mr. Kawakita, who happens to be a member of board, editorial board, who is a member. Rather long, but let me read it out. Actually, this is addressed to both Simon and Mary London. I read now. We Japanese do not see the rise of populism as compared to the one in other Western countries. Some observers, such as Peter Landers, a Tokyo bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, said it is partly because Japan has less immigrant than they have, and then the gap between rich and poor is less wide. In the United States, top 0.1% of families own roughly the same share of wealth as the bottom 90%. We see growing anger and despair among socially vulnerable people and people who feel alienated there. Nevertheless, the gap is rather increasing and undermines sense of social solidarity, which further undermines the power of democracy. The question is this: do you believe that we could rebuild democracy if we leave an issue of wealth inequality as it is? And how do we proceed and make progress in structural reforms on the inequality issues? Unquote. Big question. So, Simon, are you ready? Oh, and also, Simon, you first.
Me first. Okay.
Yes.
Wow, it's quite a question to.
And then also maybe I ask also Professor HOSOYA Sensei also after
can I just say
Mary?
one thing about inequality and Japan, which wasn't mentioned in that question, and that's the gender gap in Japan, which is a fundamental question to me, about whether Japanese democracy can deliver a better result for Japanese women, because I think that there are many women in Japan who would like to see greater equality, many women who saw Mori-san's remarks and had heard them very many times in their lives. And I think that we have a legitimate question to ask whether the democracy and the media in Japan, and Aiko DODEN mentioned this in relation to the pandemic, but these are very, very old problems. I was struck when Prime Minister Abe was leaving office and Prime Minister Suga was taking over office. There were several press conferences. Those press conferences were almost uniformly staffed by men, male journalists. There were many questions about many issues, from the Kuril Islands to North Korean abductees. As far as I recall, there was not a single question on the status of women in Japan. And I think that says quite a lot about the male-dominated media landscape in Japan, with some honourable exceptions, of course. But I do think that's a very big question for Japanese democracy that I wanted to raise. I also just wanted to make a point about that. Ravi made a very good point about democracy being a work in progress that we all need to contribute to. The media needs to contribute to this. I worked in India, lived in India for 7 years, and I really felt that India was a country where, democracy was immensely valuable, really at keeping the country together. But it's constantly a work in progress. It's constantly failing and succeeding at the same time, and we all had to struggle to keep it on the rails. So those are just some thoughts. And I've forgotten what the question was now.
Could we improve the democracy without tackling the issue of inequality in maybe not only income but also wealth?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very, very pertinent question, and I think that the capture of democracy by the elites, if you like, by the industrial and bureaucratic elites, and the marginalization of very many people is one of the biggest problems which really let in populism. So I do think that those issues absolutely need to be addressed in the United States, in Britain, and in every other country. Does the media, does the political elite really represent the whole country, and how does the economic system adjust itself so that these incredible inequalities are addressed? I don't have answers to those questions right now, but they are clearly key questions for democracies all over the world.
Thank you. Mary, could you respond from London?
Yes, as Simon said, it's a very, very big question. I think I'll just take, as it were, three headings. Migration has certainly contributed to inequality in the UK, and it was a big issue during the Brexit referendum, because I think there were a lot of, as it were, British people who felt that large levels of immigration from not just from especially Asia, but also from the European Union under the free movement policy, that this meant there was big competition for jobs, and that some people suffered falls in their living standards and their salary. That pay actually went down. Now, the economists said that this wasn't true. But there were plenty of people who said, especially artisans, people working with their hands, who said, well, actually, the rate for my job has gone down because of competition from people coming in from places where wages are lower. And I think this was an issue, and it wasn't good enough really for economists to say, no, on average, everything's absolutely fine, because for quite a lot of people, it wasn't fine. Second issue on gender. I think in the UK, we have one of the highest proportions of women in paid work in the developed countries. But I think there is a real risk, and I've written about this, there's a real risk that one of the results of the pandemic is going to be that the position of women is going to go backwards, because with the encouragement people to work from home, I would confidently expect that when people start to go back to working out of offices, more men are going to go back to working out of offices than women, that the burden of childcare during months and months when the schools have been closed has fallen disproportionately on women. And you're looking at a pattern which, even if it doesn't revert to the sort of 1950s pattern of the sort of, ideal old-fashioned family, that I think that the cause of gender equality in the UK, there's a real risk that could go backwards as a result of the pandemic. And just to remark on the difference between the UK and the US, I think there is more tolerance. There's more tolerance by people in general in the US for inequality. There is a generally more positive view of people who have a lot of money, that there is a view that they've earned it. And there is also a view that people who are poor in the US are poor in part because they're to blame. That's less simple. In the UK, it's much more complicated than that. And I would say there is less tolerance for the degree of inequality, at least as it is in the US, but also as it's developed in the UK.
Thank you very much, Mary. Now we have less than just a few minutes actually before the 5:30, which I promised to come to an end close of this symposium. But I hope, I don't think I will dare, again, as I mentioned earlier, wrap up the discussion, but I think I would ask once again then Ravi from Singapore and then Aiko from Tokyo, anything you want to just say before we close the meeting. And then finally, I would ask again Professor HOSOYA Sensei, listening to the conversation over the last, 90 minutes, if you could again also share your thought on what we have discussed today. So Ravi from Singapore, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kodama-san. I'll make this very quick. I just want to say that, look, when we discuss values like democracy, liberal democracy, and freedoms, we have to be very careful that in the interests of what we think is the larger picture, maybe today it's a geopolitical picture, we should not hesitate to call out where there are failings. I mean, last week, my column, speaking of Asia, focused on this. I said there's a credibility gap in the Quad. And I pointed out that, one of the big the partners in Quad is India. It's certainly the biggest democracy, but if it's just fallen from Freedom House list of free countries to a partly free country, I think all of us have a responsibility to stand up and point that out so that we bring India back into the list of free countries. And I would say this to Japanese journalists particularly. Some years ago, when it came to the question of the NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group, safeguards and waivers for India, I was reading a former Foreign Secretary's book, Shyam Saran's book, the other day, and he says he came to see the Japanese foreign minister of the time, Taro Aso, and Aso-san read out Japan's staunch position on nuclear weapons and all that. But then when he walked him to the lift, he said, okay, we'll make a lot of noise, but we'll quietly support you when it comes to the crunch. That's fine. Maybe you can do that once in a while. But you can't do that too often. Today, my plea in my column last week, which just exemplifies one aspect of the whole thing, is that people like Biden and maybe Abe-san or Suga-san should stand up and tell the Modis of the world, the Dutertes of the world, that, look, if you want to be in the list of free countries, you have responsibilities as well. And this is not a partial thing. Otherwise, if you're partial, then it seems contrived. It looks like, for instance, on the Quad, it'll look like everybody's ganging up on China. That reduces the credibility of the Quad and the credibility of the democratic mandate. So this cannot be a partial endeavor. It has to be for everybody to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you. It's a beautiful, I think, yes, message and really part of a conclusion of our discussion today. Now, Aiko-san, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed listening to the fellow journalists' views on how they are living through this pandemic. But I believe that the journalist's place is really in the field, and this pandemic has prevented all of us from reporting from the field, being in the field, being with the people. And I do look forward to the day when we can all do that. But in the meantime, I do hope that there will be opportunities like this, because dialogue is the crucial starting point to better understand the differences that we all have. We talk about diversity, but not so much about inclusion. Diversity is having people having different thoughts and ideas, but we have to learn to be more tolerant and have respect for such diversity. And from this conversation, the fact that we have discussed on the issue of democracy that is being tested and being challenged, this was a very good opportunity to sort of deepen our thoughts and understanding about this very crucial issue. So thank you, Ambassador Kodama.
Thank you very much. HOSOYA Sensei, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I must be brief, so I just like to focus on 2 points. One thing is that between liberalism and democracy, we can see always a tension, because liberalism usually tends to result in inequality in its nature, but on the other hand, democracy likes to have a kind of equality because of the majority rule, as Alexis Tocqueville mentioned more than 150 years ago. So always there exists a kind of a tension between liberalism and democracy. And liberal democracy has faced always challenges and tested by different kind of ideologies such as fascism or communism and so on. In 1930s, liberal democracy was challenged by fascism, fascist ideology, and 1950s as well. That ideology was tested by and challenged by communist ideology. Always, I think that liberal democracy learned something from different ideologies and swallowing, including new elements in it to be much more robust, to face challenges. But on the other hand, I see some kind of a complacency among liberal democracies nowadays. And in the end, I also like to add one point. To maintain such kind of liberal democracy and to maintain a good level of economic growth, it is important to remember that in Adam Smith's book, he focused on the importance of both sympathy and empathy. But in neoliberalism countries, we are losing kind of sympathy or empathy towards much poorer people. And richer are becoming richer, but they don't care about poorer people. Without empathy, without sympathy, maybe such kind of capitalist society cannot survive. So maybe it's a good time to look back previous history, how those liberal democracy overcame difficult challenges in the last 100 years, and without including new elements, I don't think that liberal democracy can survive the current difficult challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor HOSOYA. Again, also reminding us of a very important issue of some tension between liberalism and democracy and so on. Now, we are coming to the closing session, which will be very short. But let me first actually, this is not a summation of discussion, but I really want to share with also the participants, all of them, a few quotes from historic torch bearers of liberal democracies. I have chosen 3. First, I quote, "I am 100% convinced that our principles will in the end prevail. No one knew when the Cold War would end at the time, but it did end." This is actually Angela Merkel's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which was delivered on February the 7th, 15. And then second one is this. Democracy is the worst forms of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Famous Winston Churchill's quote, delivered on November the 11th, 1947. And finally, final one is this. Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary, unquote. Reinhold Niebuhr's famous message, which he wrote 1944, just before the end of World War II. So I think one simple message which I have got from today's discussion is, let us not underestimate liberal democracy. At the same time, as also Ravi mentioned, I think we must assiduously nourish it, or if I use the word, shape it or navigate it. So with this, I think, that is actually, anyway, thank you very much. I would like to thank, first of all, Professor HOSOYA and all the panelists for sharing their truly invaluable insights with us. Also, thank you to all of you who joined us today to listen to our webinar symposium. This brings today's international webinar on the topic Democracy at the Crossroads, the challenge of populism and competition over values to a close. We will be sending a survey form about this webinar to everyone who participated today. So please respond to it if possible. Last, not but least, let me also thank my staff all of them at the center who worked so hard to make this webinar a resounding success. Also to all those people who helped successfully host this webinar here in Tokyo. Thank you all again for taking the time today to join this webinar. For our 45th anniversary, the FPCJ plans to hold, of course, another international webinar, if possible, on the other overarching topic of what I call the mega trends facing the global world, including climate change or DX, digital transformation, and also many other issues, I think, of the day. So we hope to see you again participating in these future webinars again. So by then, thank you very much. Thank you all, and goodbye.